Hi, I'm still John Atack, and I have a new guest today. Always exciting. This is Anthony Spurgin. Hi, Anthony.
Hello, everyone. It's awesome to be here.
It's good to have you. And you're going to take us into territory that I have not explored on this channel. You're involved with what is called the traditionalist wing of the Catholic Church. And
hmm
looking at that, what happened was that between 1962 and 1965, the Second Vatican Council was held, which aimed to modernize the church and bring it into the 20th century or somewhere near the 20th century. And part of that was that translations of the Tridentine Mass were to be used. So that traditionally the Mass had been in Latin, and readings would be taken from the Vulgate Bible in Latin, and people like me would sit there going, I've got no idea what they're talking about. And there were some people who like the old way, and they're called traditionalists, but there are a multitude of different traditionalist groups as far as I can make out. So tell us your story.
All right. Well, I am a Texan. My ancestry is English, but I was born in Dallas, Texas, and grew up in a suburb of Dallas called Irving. And Irving has a few interesting distinctions in that it's where the Cowboys used to play, and I watched their stadium get demolished, bombed and collapsed. And so, watching a football stadium, crumble is a pretty interesting experience. And
Yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald lived in Irving for a while in the last year of his life, and it's also got an interesting, unusually large representation of cults
Mm,
because the Dallas Scientology branch is located in Irving.
okay.
Irving has more than one Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. I could walk from where I'm at right now to a Unification Church uh, building. It's like a congregation of cults, a congregation.
Mm,
And I was raised Catholic, and m at first it was going to main what you could call normal
mm.
mainstream Catholic churches and what the traditionalists would call the Novus Ordo. And of course, there's gonna
The
be a
new
lot of
order.
Latin.
Mm,
New Order, yeah. It's gonna be a lot of Latin phrases and terminology as we go along in here.
excellent.
Uh, yeah, and so, but at some point, my parents started to gravitate more towards the traditionalist wing flavor of Catholicism.
Mm,
So the for a long time growing up, the traditionalists did not have their own building. They didn't have their own church. They would have mass at the Carmelite nuns parish where the cloistered nuns lived. They had their own little private chapel. And I never w g g we went I remember going there for a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, and, I remember the nun because the nuns were cloistered, we never saw them,
mm,
they and so I do remember one instance where my mom was talking to one of them, and it was, like, through a screen, and she would,
mm,
like, hand her things, under this little, opening, this little hole, and you could hear her voice coming through, but you would, they're, completely cut off from the outside world in
mm.
there, and, so eventually the traditionalists got their own building, in Irving, and the parish was named Mater Dei, Mother of God, and, um, when right about the same time the church started, a homeschool co-op was opened and started operating, outside, or in the school building next to the chapel. And homeschooling is going to be very much tied into all of this
Okay.
because I was homeschooled. I went to a public school a little bit for elementary school, but most of my educational experience until I went to college was homeschooling. And
Mm,
for those who don't know, a co-op is not it's where a bunch of different families who are usually Catholic or evangelical Christian who have a lot of kids, and they distrust or they have issues with the educational system. They run these co-ops where it can be done out of someone's houses. That's how it's done for me,
mm,
and it's not. That's how it was done for me at first. And I want to make this point clear. It's not necessarily an isolated experience.
mm,
There's sort of a stereotype where it's like you're at home by yourself and mom and dad is teaching you, and I had a little bit of that because my mom, she's a Montessori teacher, and so she is an
okay.
educator. But for the most part, I was in class with a lot of other kids like any other school system, only it was usually once a week, usually on Thursdays, and it was a lot more relaxed, for sure, and, I mean, there's no way around it. I had a lot of free time,
Mm.
far more than most kids my age, so I had a very, you know, my educational experience was very unusual and off the beaten path, to say the least, but so that's the basic setup of the whole situation, and,
And
you know,
how old were you when your parents moved towards traditionalism?
it was a gradual thing. I can remember starting to go. I think it was definitely around when I was 12
Mm,
when we were still going we would still go to the normal, and we didn't have, like, a specific parish we regularly attended because Irving's got a lot of churches, and it's got, like, 5 maybe, like, 5 or 6 Catholic
mm,
churches in the city. We would kind of ping pong around to different ones. But the community of homeschoolers very much gravitated toward the traditionalists, and if so eventually, when we started to get more into that, I think it was definitely around 12, 11, or 12 is when we started mostly going to the traditional parish, but this was back when they didn't have their own building.
mm,
And I think it was right when I was starting high school, right when I was turning 14, is when they got their own building. It used to be like this Korean denomination of this Korean Christian Korean church that became abandoned, and they bought and refurbished eventually to look like a traditional Catholic parish. And so, yeah, I was 14 when it really got hardcore, and it was sort of my exclusive experience of Catholicism, pretty much.
mm.
12 when my parents started to get more interested in it.
Okay. And
Yeah.
what is it that you essentially want the world to know about this group? And what
Well,
happened that
I yeah,
was
exactly. I do
making you
not
speak
believe the
out?
exactly. I do not believe I do not I'm not here to call the Catholic Church a cult because it's not, but I think it undoubtedly has generated various subgroups of Catholicism that are very much they operate and behave exactly like destructive cults,
Mm,
and I have no other real definition to them. I have no other word to use for them. A lot of people point to Opus Dei as an example of a destructive cult, and I actually had some experience with Opus Dei, but it wasn't personally negative for me. That is not to say that obviously that's not to negate the stories and experiences of many people who have
mm,
claimed that it was for them, but in my instance, it wasn't. But
mm,
in terms of traditional Catholicism, the Catholics who reject Vatican II, reject the Second Vatican Council, the reason it's what I want the world to know, and what I'm trying to get out there is that okay, I'll just talk about my own personal example to illustrate this.
by all means.
I was sexually abused by a priest there. Now I want to make a, a clear distinction here when I say that. He never physically touched me in an inappropriate way. But what he did to me, I can still categorize as sexual abuse
Mm,
because right when I was turning 14, this training began to essentially pulverize my sexual identity because the Catholic Church's teaching is that sexual relationships are for the married only.
mm,
LGBT, forget about it. And they take they very much zero in on on a line Jesus said where he said like I say to you, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery in your heart.
mm,
So to them, lust, period, is adultery.
mm.
And of course, adultery is one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not commit it.
Yep.
And so you, they, I was trained to wrestle, to violently wrestle with my sexual urges, my sexual desires, even the health that when it was perfectly healthy and perfectly natural. Young people need rational guidance as they navigate their sexual
Mm.
awakenings.
Very
And
much.
my guidance was to just suppress it totally, to the point where I was instructed to physically hurt myself, to expunge sexual thoughts. One specific example was, I was told by this priest if my thoughts were getting too out of my control, like I couldn't stop thinking about, whatever, I had to put my fingers on the floor, like interlock them and kneel on them, and do that while I'm saying 3 Hail Marys. So that's training to associate to have these thoughts and for your mind to go, "Oh," to associate physical pain with them.
Aversion
So,
therapy.
aversion therapy, exactly, and so, as a result of this, training I went through or these instructions I was given, my relationships are still my personal relationships are still a great struggle.
Mm.
And, I haven't since high school, I have not had a relationship that's lasted, more than 2 weeks.
Oh dear.
Um, I did have a girlfriend at the time, but we did not have a very healthy relationship because we were never allowed to be alone ever. There was not one instance where me and my girlfriend were ever alone. We weren't allowed to kiss. We weren't allowed to really show any public displays of affection, hardly like hugging and that's it, and like the kind of kisses you would give your grandmother. But you know, you can't you can't get to know someone like that.
Mm.
You can't get to come to a healthy experience of affection or love or when you're being watched the whole time. It's totally like a police state. It's totally like Big Brother. It's that eyes on you all the time. It's just it's spiritual threats constantly.
Mm.
So their view on sexuality is perverse and warped, and it leads to widespread mental suffering, and it can permanently damage people. There was a kid there was a guy I knew at the time who was, I think he's basically my age and maybe a little older, a little younger, I'm not sure, but I remember this very well. He ran away from home, and there was something said about why he did, but it turned out he was so repressed, he stole some money and went out and bought a hooker. Because the environment was so repressive that he'd rather be on the streets, if that meant finding some kind of release, of this. Because another thing is, when you don't release this stuff, you know it 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 just builds up and builds up and it doesn't go anywhere, and it really crushes and damages you. So I'm doing a lot better now. I mean, I'm in therapy, been on medication every now and then, and so I'm getting to a much better place. But another unfortunate thing that happened to me as well was I was discouraged by this same priest, whose name, by the way, was Father Phil Wolf, with a little e at the end of it, and he is part of the FSSP, which is the Priestly Fraternity of Saint Peter, this
Okay.
order of traditional priests. I was also discouraged by him to get, psychological help because I've had anxiety and depression for my whole life, basically,
Okay.
and he was discouraging of me to, go to him for all these mental issues, for all these psychological issues, and his prescription was always just more prayer, more penance, more physical pain to myself, and and penance is a very important concept, in all of this that we can talk about later. But yeah, he said, "Don't go to a therapist, don't go to a psychologist." And so I could have been treated much earlier
Mm.
for these issues that have plagued me and, really negatively affected my life. I could have had them handled much sooner,
Yeah.
than I did. And so I could go on about all kinds of things, but the environment is toxic,
mm,
especially to young people, especially to children. Um, the environment, it warps your sexual identity, and it tries to keep you in sort of an infantilized, childlike state. It creates a state of arrested development,
mm.
essentially, where you don't get to fully grow up because they value childlike obedience, childlike
Absolutely. Yeah.
acceptance of what they're telling you.
Mm,
And so therefore they need to keep you in kind of a childlike state, um where you surrender your growth, your the natural growth of that most humans go, that gets warped for the sake of, you know for the sake of not for the sake of penance again, for the sense of, for the sake of, you know you know cleansing yourself of sin. And
mm.
so that's my main message here, is
Okay.
that they should be in the same category as Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, all of that, but they should be also understood to be very distinct
Mm.
from the mainstream Catholic Church, which has its own problems.
It does have one or two. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the word cult has become rather redundant with time. That um, because originally it just meant followers of a particular leader or a particular doctrine. That's all the word really means. It's not pejorative. It's not negative, but it's
Mhm.
been picked up by the media and by some social scientists and turned into it's become so vague it's impossible to really say what it means. And you use the term destructive cult, which is the
Yeah.
appropriate thing to say, that it's not whether people follow a belief system, it's whether it's destructive to them or other
Yeah.
people. And my focus for a long time has been very much on authoritarianism, the idea that there are people who want to be worshipped as gods, want to to be obeyed in their every desire, and there are people who will do that. And you know as you say, it's a system of obedience, it's an authoritarian system. And you know I do have problems with the mainstream Catholic Church. Of course, we all do, after
Yeah.
the cover up of sexual abuse that went on. I mean, when the Australian Royal Commission investigated, they found 500 priests who had abused 8,000 people. Portugal in January, I think it was January of this year, announced findings of a similar type, that there were many priests who were abusers, and that was tremendously covered up. I think it comes out of the mentality. I have very close friends who are Christians. I don't have any problem with the way they behave or the way they believe. They are people who do good in the world, and so it doesn't concern me that their set of beliefs. I find much that is helpful in the teaching of Christianity and indeed of Judaism before it,
Mhm.
and since. But these organizations that have come about, which, as you say, infantilize people, or they seek to keep you in the kind of prepubescent state, somewhere around the
Mhm.
age of 12 in normal development. And it, it, I don't see any reason in that. It seems to me, I do not consider human beings to be fundamentally sinful and evil. Um,
Yeah.
and that is a foundation of much Christianity, the idea of the sin of Adam,
Original sin.
original sin. And so treating people in that way, to me, is wrong. I think we should treat people as um, both potentially both good and evil. That we have those
Yeah.
capacities. And it tremendously concerns me when I hear about Opus Dei or the Legion of Christ, or whichever group, using punishments. Um, I was watching some stuff about Mother Teresa, and I didn't realize quite how far her movement had spread. And one of the
Mhm.
former nuns said, "Oh, and then I was introduced to the discipline, and the discipline is a knotted piece of rope." And she then went into the the lavatories to hear, and had heard her fellow nuns flogging themselves in there before, and she applied it to her back and realized that wasn't the sound she was hearing from the other cubicles, and realized they were beating themselves on their inner thighs. Now, to anybody who post sort of Havelock Ellis, who preceded Freud, in the 19th century, since then we've understood that there is masochism. There is a sexual practice whereby people, the pleasure pain separation becomes is indistinct, let's say, and so people create heightened sensations by hurting themselves, and that the Catholic Church and the traditionalist movement has not understood this fundamental aspect of psychology, that repressing our sexuality and brutalizing ourselves is of itself a sexual perversion. And
Right. I mean, you're exactly right. They have a that's another aspect of them that makes them extremely harmful,
mm,
is that they don't understand how the mind works at all. They don't understand how the human brain works at all, and they don't they don't think it's possible to be traumatized if you're what they call it offering it up. There's a we talk about thought stopping cliches,
mm,
a word or phrase you can say that ends the conversation to them, to the cult member. And a very common one you would hear is if you would express that I'm suffering, I'm having a rough time, their response would be, well, offer it up. Tell God basically, I am I am going to endure whatever I'm enduring as a sacrifice to you so that I don't know, heaven will be nicer or that something good will happen as a response. And there's this ingrained attitude of harm equals spirit, like pain in this world equals pleasure, spiritual pleasure in the next world. So you're accumulating brownie points also for heaven basically.
mm,
But what you're also doing is you're just actively traumatizing yourself or seeking out experiences that will leave you traumatized,
mm,
you know? Some of the in the Catholic Church, the most revered and venerated saints were men who routinely, engaged in physical acts of, uh, self-harm to themselves. Saint Francis, for example, used to
yep,
roll around naked in the snow. Um, if you saw if you were to see Saint Francis today, you would think this guy needs to be institutionalized. That this guy needs to, and that goes for a lot of the saints who, and of course, you know, they it, that that is not the reason I bring that up as a specific issue for the traditional Catholics is that that isn't really a thing in the mainstream Catholic world really much at all. They don't talk about they don't talk about the saints of the past that much in your mainstream Catholic church. They'll talk about Jesus, they'll talk about, Mary, um, but they won't talk about a lot of the saints throughout the church's history because a lot of them did some crazy shit. That would be crazy by today's standards.
mm,
And of course, there's also a rejection in the traditional Catholic world of modern society's standards. They have contempt for them,
mm,
and so they want the world to look like medieval Europe, basically. They want us to go back. They and very many of them will just unapologetically say that.
mm,
And medieval Europe was hell. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. It was hell on earth. It was the reason we call it the Dark Ages. Um,
yeah.
so yeah.
I mean, it depended on where you were and what was going on. There's a tremendous variety in
Sure.
history, but if we look to a specific in, when the Black Death broke out
Hmm.
in 1347, there were flagellant processions throughout Europe,
Yeah.
and something like a third of the population of Europe was extinguished in a couple of years. So
Hmm.
this incredible event. And so there were processions of people, and they would have leather belts, and they would put iron nails into the leather belts, and they would walk around flogging
Yeah.
themselves on their backs. Um, we find this aberration through a variety of religions. It's not unique to the Catholic Church, sadly. There are Shiite Muslims who will use swords to cut themselves while marching along.
Yeah.
And somehow the ecstatic experience of pain that many of these people are getting to becomes confused with virtue. It's as if they've done something good in the world by hurting themselves. And from the 21st century perspective, this is a very strange way to be. But as you say, in the Middle Ages, and back through history, it was considered quite normal. It was normalized that if you could endure great pain and suffering, then you were in some way saintly. At the beginning of fairly near the beginning of the Christian movement in the early centuries, you have the Stylites who sit on top of a pole. They have a little platform on a pole, and they will live their lives sat on that pole. Um,
Right.
and then you in Hindu India, you'll find fakirs who have extended their arm until it became paralyzed and
Yeah.
useless. And this is taken, the famous bed of nails. And I'm fairly convinced this is because of the ecstatic states, that by progressing through pain, that you can achieve a kind of bliss. And I think it's an incredibly dangerous idea
Yeah.
because it leads to nothing good in the world. It doesn't mean that you go and help people.
Mhm. Well, I think where part of it comes from what you said, the idea that humanity is just intrinsically bad. We're just inherently there's just something inherently wrong with
Mm,
us, and so therefore we're demonstrating that to God. We're letting God know, look, see how bad we are. Look, I'm hitting myself. I'm flogging. I'm kneeling on my fingers. I'm whipping myself. I'm proving to you that I know that I suck.
mm,
That's sort of the attitude they have to God, and also it what also is going on, I think, is that they're hijacking a true aspect of reality, which is a lot of the times you get gained through pain in the sense of working out is not always fun. It kinda sucks to really work out, but you'll have a great hopefully, you'll have a great body at the end of it. You'll be healthy, you'll be fit, you'll be
mm,
strong. You do have to make a lot of money, you have to work a lot, and that can suck as well. So, clearly, and this is just an obvious fact of life that we all recognize, there's lots of things that we have to do that are strenuous, hard, painful, difficult that will reap good results.
mm,
But they've convinced themselves that that applies to the afterlife, that applies to heaven, that applies to the spirit, and especially because, Jesus, had to die, had to be tortured and die on a cross and to redeem us because 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 we're so bad. He had to do that because we were so bad. We're just so bad inherently, and the whole original sin element to all this. I've never I mean, it made sense at the time, but you know, if you met someone and they're like, "Hey, my great grandfather was a serial killer," you would not. I would think your reaction wouldn't be like, "Arrest this person, police, arrest them." You wouldn't hold them in any
mm,
way responsible for the actions of their ancestors.
mm,
Yet all of us share the responsibility of our first ancestors, Adam and Eve, eating some fruit. I know that never says it's an apple. It just says fruit, I think, in Genesis. So I always imagine it as a banana. Uh, because Adam and Eve both ate this banana, or whatever. Now we're all punished. We're all carry that stain woven into us. Saint
mm,
Augustine actually thought that original sin is basically is semen. That that original sin is just woven into semen, and so that's why it's intrinsically a part of each one of us. And that just makes no moral sense. No, it just makes no sense. Period to me.
mm. I mean, I see that I'm a student of religion. I've spent my life studying religious groups, cults, lots of them, because it fascinates me. Because at the age
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
13, in a religious education class, I asked the teacher one week if he believed that anybody other than his own sect, he was a Methodist or Wesleyan, if anybody other than his own sect would go to heaven. And he paused and said no, which I thought, considering he was teaching in an Anglican school, was interesting. But I wasn't going to tell on him. But the next week, it just
Yeah.
popped into my mind, and I said, "Do you believe God could ever forgive the devil?" And he said, "No." And a switch flipped inside me. It's like, well, I'm not going to worship this God then, because this is meant to be a God of forgiveness. And as we as mere human beings are capable of forgiveness, surely God is capable
Yeah.
of forgiveness. Now, I was 13, it wasn't deep theology, but I, ever since then, have been quite fascinated by the way that a belief will lead to a behavior. Now, we misquote Voltaire on this channel frequently. Those who believe absurdities may commit atrocities. And when we start digging into those beliefs, why do we believe this particular thing? So why do we believe that man is evil? And you sort of say, well, it's because of the book of Genesis. And you say, well, the book of Genesis, I have a few problems with the book of Genesis. One is that there are two books in there and they conflict with one another. And they are actually from two different manuscripts. Probably the Judean and Israelite manuscripts are pushed together. And so we have Adam as the first created thing, where he helps God name everything as it comes into being. But we also have Adam as the last but one created thing, Eve being the last. So there are conflicts in the story itself. And then we kind of go, well, let's look at this historically. What we have is a set of stories which may be useful to us. As Joseph Campbell said, mythology is not history, it is psychology, and so much else. It's a philosophy. And so when we hear about, Noah in the ark, or Jonas in the whale, or Daniel in the lion's den, we're being taught something that might be useful to us. Now, the Jewish approach to that is that Torah, the Old Testament, is something that can be discussed. It's not, though of course there are many sects of Judaism, and I can't cover them all, but in talking with Jews, there's this idea that this is up for conversation to try and
Yeah.
understand it. In Christianity, in many of the sects of Christianity, not in all, there is this formulation: this is the received word of God. This is what it says. Now, with archaeology, this has become a very difficult position to hold, because the stories of Genesis, of course, we know the Bible itself tells us that Abraham comes from Ur in Sumeria. And if we look back at the Babylonian and before them the Sumerian stories, we find Genesis. It's there. It's there 1,500 years before the first possible use of it by the Habiru, by the Hebrews, which is somewhere around 900 BC.
Yeah.
You can go back 2,500 to 2,500 BC and find Babylonian originals, which are pictures on ring seals, as they're called, which show the mother goddess, Asherah, who is the mother of Yahweh, Jehovah,
Yahweh.
or El, um,
Hmm.
welcoming, using the snake, who represents her husband El, who one of the names of God used by Jews and Christians, who are welcoming humanity into the garden to eat the fruit. And the fruit is actually specific there. It's a date. In
It's a
case you,
date. Okay.
yeah, it's a date. There are date palms in these images. So we see that a story's been taken and it's been reframed and given a different meaning to then maintain certain aspects of society which are now completely lost. We have no idea how the Jews lived in, say the time of Ezra, when the temple is first really coming into being. We do pretty much know that there was no Egyptian captivity. There's no evidence
Okay.
for that at all. So
Hmm.
when we get into the history of all of this, that's one set of things. Then we get into the beliefs and the stories that we tell. And I feel that if these stories are useful to us and they make us behave in a compassionate and humble way towards other human beings, they are good. But where they create this draconian authoritarian society where it's being insisted that you can't possibly have a useful thought because
Right.
it's all been had before. I have a couple of fundamental problems. One of them is I wouldn't worship anyone that wanted to be worshipped. You know,
Yeah.
it's quite simple. It's narcissism, and I don't approve of it. I like there's an idea put forward by certain Sufi teachers in Islam that God created the world to share his beauty, which I think is a rather lovely idea, rather than creating the world to oppress us all, send us to perpetual
Right.
destruction. The other
Right.
idea, and I do have a friend who's Russian Orthodox believer and incredibly erudite, and he tells me that I'm meant to read a book by C.S. Lewis, which I haven't got around to yet. And he said he's a Protestant, you know, but nonetheless. And this is the question: how could you be in heaven and be happy that there were people being tortured in hell? What kind of person would that make you?
Yeah.
And
It, well, I mean, they have sort of a. I think their explanation. I mean, I do remember having the same questions and finding their response to that, which was basically, you won't even think about them. Like you will have like even if you were married to them, even if they were your if it's your mom or your son, you will just be so overwhelmed by the beatific vision, as they call it, and divine justice that you will just be like, it's just so just. It's just you'll understand. It will all make sense, and that's again thought stopping cliche. It'll make sense in heaven. Think how great heaven will be. No more no more stress, no more confusion, and it doesn't make sense now, but hold on, just keep praying, that there and yeah, there it makes it so where your personal relationships, if the person is not uh a traditionalist Catholic and they die, they're um almost certainly going to hell. I mean, they have a phrase for it in Latin: "Extra ecclesiam nulla salus." Outside the church, there is no salvation. And that was actually defined as a dogma of the church by previous popes. And after the Second Vatican Council, the Vatican II was really good at not really explicitly changing anything per se, but changing the emphasis, changing the we just don't talk about that anymore. We let's to think about something else. Let's focus on the good things Jesus said. And again, I you said that you find a lot of things in Christianity, some things you find valuable. I think that he among you who is not without sin cast not the first stone. I think that might be the most beautiful thing that's ever been said. Like, that's one of the most beautiful sentences I can possibly imagine.
But as I
But
recollect it, I was brought up as
yeah,
an Anglican, so I have the King James Bible, and let him who is without sin cast the first stone.
something, yeah,
Rendered in
basically the
that
same
way,
thing. There's different, it gets phrased differently in
of course.
different
Yeah.
translations and all of that. Traditionalist Catholics, their preferred version of the Bible is called the Dure Reims.
Mm.
I don't know how different. I know that the King James was like, we don't read that. That
No.
was sort of verboten. Yeah, you don't
And
look at that.
it's not accurate. There are more accurate translations, but the King James has the virtue of possibly being the most beautiful thing ever written in the English language. It's about the only
Mm,
contest that Shakespeare has, and
okay.
it's a bizarre book. I thought for many years that how could it be that a group of people got together and wrote a book, and then found out that it's actually an adaptation of the Bishop's Bible that existed before, which in turn is an
Okay.
adaptation of Tyndale's Bible. And Tyndale, of course, was burned
Yeah.
at the stake for writing it. But
Yeah.
we come to this place of contradiction. So when you go to heaven, you won't have any conscience. But that's the
Yeah.
fundamental
Okay.
definition of a psychopath. You won't care what happens to other people. You won't have any compassion for others. I'm not
Yeah,
interested. I'm definitely going to hell because there'll be people there who need help. And it is a
yeah.
very, religions exist. I when I left Scientology, which is 40 years ago now this week, um, I thought that the idea that we're all infested with little beings, which in Scientology are called body thetans, and you only find out about, I'd been in for 7 years before I'd paid enough money to be told about this.
Right.
But I remember when I was 18, I learned Zen meditation in a monastery, a Zen monastery in England, and there was a Tibetan tanka on the wall. And I remember this thing, and they told me that the meditator in it was fighting the demons in his world. And so I, naively didn't really connect the idea that every religion has some kind of demon, the Gadons of the
Yeah.
Tibetans, the Dibuks of the jinns and genies of Islam. And I went and read I read 5 books about Tibetan Buddhism, and the last of them was a PhD thesis called Tibetan Buddhist Medicine and Psychiatry. And the woman who'd written it had studied with the Dalai Lama's physician.
Mm.
And I still had a very pro-Buddhist attitude at that time and continued until about 10 years ago when I started to have problems with that too.
Mm.
But in this book, there was an explanation of something that is so straightforward and which I've now seen in so many societies, that the society is split in 3, that you have the peasants who are in Tibet illiterate, not schooled at all. And so you tell them they're infested with demons, and if they rub yak's butter on themselves and say the right things, the demons will go away. And that's the method of healing. You then have the educated people, and you tell them that they have thought forms. They have to deal with these thought forms. They're no longer little beings. But then the Dalai Lama's vision says, and then of course you have the Buddhists, the monks, and we understand that everything is illusion, that however we describe it, we're making it up.
Mm.
And these forms, the primitive religion, where it's all devotion and worship and self-abasement and self-harm, they spread throughout the world. Beyond that, you have a more intelligent discussion about what was Jesus actually teaching. Was Jesus, where does he say you're meant to flog yourself? Where does he say you're meant to kneel on your fingers? Where does all of this stuff come from? I'm told that the Amish, that they've had some problems in the last generation because they've started reading the Bible in English, and they're not meant to. I think their Bible is in sort of old High German or something. So most of them don't speak the language, just as it was up to Vatican II, where you could go to church and you could sit there for 2 hours and not understand a word that was said. It was all about the holy atmosphere that was being created,
Well, but the aura, yeah, the environment,
the
yeah.
ambience. And
Mhm.
with the Amish, apparently some of them were very surprised to find that there was nothing about whether they were to cross their suspenders or not. And of course, with Lutherans,
Or suspenders at all. There's no suspenders in the Bible,
oh
right?
no,
Oh, no,
what are
yeah.
we going to do? And I mean, you have this thing with Luther and Zwingli and Tyndale. The people are pushing
Mhm.
the translation of the Bible, and people are saying, well, where are the priests and the nuns and the monks? There aren't
Yeah,
any. How did this
yeah,
happen? And you have this false idea that St. Peter hands the keys to the first pope and they come down. We don't even know who the first 2 popes were. The Catholic Church doesn't know. It admits that the first 4, there are 2 of them they can name. And the idea that there's an unbroken tradition, given the various anti-popes of the Middle Ages, there's a point where you had 3
mhm,
different popes going on. So who's genuinely a successor? And when you see what Pius IX and Pius X did in Germany, in basically putting Hitler into power, it was the Catholic Workers'
yeah,
Political Party that gave him the last thing. And the man who became Pius X was the emissary of Pius IX, who made those
yeah.
agreements.
And they
So
were aware about the concentration camps too, from what I understand. There was
they
something that recently came out where they knew about that.
they knew about the camps, and Pius IX knew about the Warsaw Ghetto, and he knew the ghetto had been established. and that it was being used to destroy the Jews. But having said that, the Catholic Church was the last organization in the world to actually suspend, in the Vatican City, you used to have to wear a mark to show that you were Jewish if you went into the Vatican City. So they were the last. Hitler adopted this with the yellow star and brought it back. But we have all of this confusion. We have the contemporary abuse scandals involving so many people. I think it's important not to lose the sense of what religion should be for. Um, the
Yeah.
law is made for man, not man for the law, as Jesus put it. That we should be seeking to live good lives, not, going, well, we'll get to heaven, and we get twists of dogma that are so terrible. In Buddhism, you have a dogma called Poa, and Sahara, who founded Shinrikyo, got hold of this doctrine and said it's accelerated karma. So you take somebody and you get them through all of the bad karma they've got coming to them. And this, with Shinrikyo, came to the idea of killing the whole population of Japan.
Yeah.
And of
With
course,
gas.
yeah, with sarin gas, which is a nerve gas. And they had enough stockpile to kill 4 million people by the time they were caught. And
Man.
they performed various
God.
murders and what. But you see how this thought is twisted. It's like, we will bring goodness to the world by getting you through all of your bad karma, and we'll bring you
Yeah,
to
trial
that.
by fire.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it is. I mean, it's more medieval than the Middle Ages. That the
Yeah.
insanity of these ideas. So,
Yeah.
what can be done? Do you feel? I mean, obviously, the first thing is to say, look, people, this is what's happening. But is it
Mhm.
possible to, normally with a cult group or so-called cult group, the idea would be to find some way of talking to the members and helping them to
Yeah.
escape from the confines of this belief system. Is there any approach that can be made towards the traditionalist movement?
Well, things are being done at the Vatican. There's a been a since Vatican II, there's been a war going on between the Vatican and the traditional Catholics.
Mm,
And Francis has recently, well, last year he released an encyclical called Traditionis Custodes, which means custody of tradition. And he basically did a crackdown. Benedict before him had been much more sympathetic toward the traditionalists, and
mm,
he gave them a bunch of. Um, he opened the door for them a lot more and gave them a bunch of goodies and treated them well. And Francis has not been treating them as well, and he's giving the local bishops a lot more authority over because like there's you won't I don't think you'll find hardly there's like one bishop who is like a pro traditionalists and I think just one and his name is Joseph Strickland and he was the bishop of Tyler, Texas, but he's been suspended by the Vatican and is probably going to be removed pretty soon. Um but in the steps Francis is taking in terms of giving bishops authority, a lot more authority to shut these places down if they so choose,
mm,
is a concrete step I would say to making the abuses stop and raising and doing something about this abusive culture. But at the same time, that has the opposite effect of making them far more engaged and animated in their crusade. The traditionalists, I mean,
yeah.
the walls are closing in. We're being oppressed more, and of course, every cult, emphasis creates this. We're we're they're coming to get us. It's any minute now that it's Armageddon around the corner. We're all going to be destroyed. The world hates us, but it's a self-fulfilling thing because they abuse people
Mhm.
and they treat people like shit, and then these people leave and want to speak out and talk about it, and then they say, "Look at we're so oppressed. We're just trying to practice our religion in peace, and these people are coming. These evil people are coming after us. So, and the traditionalists are very much, they have a lot of online presence. They like to create YouTube channels, and there's one person in particular named Taylor Marshall, who is a traditionalist Catholic. He was just on Glenn Beck, and I never had a face to face conversation with him, but I saw him all the time. He still attends this modern day parish. He actually has a candidacy. He actually is a candidate for president technically, although um, he has about as much chance as
A snowflake in
y-
hell.
yeah, yeah, exactly about as much chance as Snowflake in Hell. And but his presidential platform is based around installing the social reign of Christ the King. That's sort of the phrase they have to summarize what they want. Their vision of society is the social reign of Christ the King.
Mm,
And they're all monarchists across the board. They want America to have a king. Essentially, they want it they have a great romanticism for the British monarchy. I don't think they're big fans of the current British monarchy. I think they think King Charles is woke, um, but which I don't think he is. Um, but I'll admit I don't claim to be a huge expert on the monarchy. But I I think that raising awareness as well. I think that normal Catholics need to start understanding this more, because these groups get lost in the shuffle, because Catholicism is such a huge thing. It's such a massive church that all these subgroups that spring out of it get kind of, people don't really understand the distinction between them,
mm,
and they're almost like your average Catholic church and a traditional church are basically two separate religions.
mm,
You could say, and I want to, what you said about understanding, why what people get out of religion and what it's supposed to do for them. It's supposed to, strengthen communities. It's supposed to unite people and to, create, a sense of compassion for your fellow man, a sense of, you know, it's meant to bring people together. But the problem is, so often, is that people get too focused in on of the rules that get put in place, and that invariably creates the exact problem you were trying to avoid,
mm,
because you start pushing people aside, and you start becoming, suspicious of other groups who are acting not believing the exact same things you do, not acting the exact same way you do. And within the world of traditional Catholicism, it is so rigid and so based on what is written, without any consideration of what is human. All they do is point to the text and they say, it says it right here, end of story.
mm.
This pope said that this pope in 1565 says you can't passionately kiss someone. So therefore, me in 2015 can't kiss my girlfriend at all. And they get, you know, they get it's they get so stuck in
Well,
in the
let's
past.
just point out that there were two popes
Yeah.
who declared you could be excommunicated for wearing a beard.
Hmm.
So, and being
Oops.
infallible yeah, I think you're in trouble there.
Yep.
That we find so much that, and again, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most remarkable statements ever made, you know, in human language, that these, alas, you priests and hypocrites, you close the door of heaven in other men's faces, and having done so, you do not enter yourselves. You're like a
Yeah.
whited sepulchre, whitewashed boneyard. That
Yeah.
it seemed to me that, in my understanding is that the time of Jesus, you have sects within Judaism, and some of them are legalists, and that you've got to follow the law exactly. And Jesus comes as an anti-legalist. He comes as somebody who's saying, let's get rid of all of this stuff. Let's, and he cites Rabbi Hillel is supposed to have said it before that
Yeah.
a rabbi came to Hillel, and Hillel said to him, can you recite the laws of God while standing on one leg? And the guy said, no, there are hundreds of these things. And Hillel grabs his ankle, pulls up his leg, and says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength. Something like that, which Jesus will repeat. One of the most remarkable people I've ever met was the Archbishop of Crete, Archbishop Irenaeus. And I had the great good fortune to spend about 5 hours in his company in St. Petersburg.
Oh.
And he was, I gave a talk to about 200 men in black, which was quite freaky, especially as the laughs all came a minute late because they were having simultaneous translation. It was very difficult.
Oh.
But this talk was split into two, and after the second part of the talk, I walked into the refectory in the Lavra in St. Petersburg, which is a remarkable place. And there, it seats 200 or 300 monks. And there was just this one little guy sat there, and he beckoned me over and sat me down and put some salad on my plate. And we got into this conversation, and there was just something about the man. He had become gentle. And when he'd realized that telling me stories about Muslims praying and miracles happening for them wasn't really going to cut it with me, I'm a bit more advanced in my thinking and storytelling. He moved over and he said, well, what do you believe? And I said, well, I believe in compassion, and I've tried to have a little compassion, and I at least know the meaning of the word humility, even though I don't have any. And he smiled and he looked at me. He said, humility that's the foundation of everything. And we see these arrogant people who want to tell us how to live and what to do, have no interest in what we think, and who've just got a little rule book that they thumb through and say, well, if you do that, then you'll be damned. They are not Christian. What they're doing, whatever sect they belong to, is not what Christ was teaching, or what I understand of Christ's teaching. In terms of helping people who continue to believe things which are harmful to themselves and others, and that's the problem. I don't really care what people believe as long as they don't hurt other people, and preferably don't hurt themselves. But and this will go out after this event has occurred. But David Miscavige, the Führer of Scientology, as I like to think of him, or monarch, you could say.
Lord Farquaad from Shrek.
That's it.
Yeah.
And he's coming to England for the first time in some years, and people are arranging a protest. And as ever, of course, I've been invited to join this protest. A few years back in, I think, 2015, there was a thing called Flag Down that was held at Clearwater by my dear friend Pete Griffiths. And I was asked to go and speak there. And I'm kind of going, you're going to Clearwater, Florida, where Scientology is very well established, so that people who criticize Scientology can speak publicly in the place that's most dangerous to us in all the world. But what is that going to make the people inside the Flag Land Base, the Fort Harrison, what is it going to make them feel that there are these people protesting?
Yeah.
This was around, Anonymous had been protesting outside Scientology buildings, and it frightened me. It worried me. It's sort of, what is the point of this? Is it cathartic for the people doing the shouting in some way? Yeah. Because for the people who are inside the buildings, it's terrifying. And as you say, adding to their fear of persecution, adding to their phobia of the outside world is not helpful. And it is, as the Archbishop Irenaeus said to me, to have compassion and with some humility to approach people and see if you can help them in some way to overcome, this terrible mire that they find themselves in, and bring them to a point where they can interpret the Christian teaching as being Christian, as being something that cares for other people.
Well, it's just so strange that they think that this guy Jesus, who had his message was, let's throw the old rule book away. Let's you know, have he wasn't a warlord. He wasn't a violent person, other than I guess that one instance where he was, throwing the money
Money
lenders out. The
changers.
one time, the money changers, yeah, the one time he gets physical is at capitalism,
Mm.
uh, and he hangs out with prostitutes. He hangs out with lepers, the outcasts of society, and
Tax
then the
gatherers, even
tax
the
gatherers, exactly,
worst.
and then yeah, and then to think that this guy would start an authoritarian empire, which is what the Catholic Church became. It became the Pope had an army, at his disposal and for the Crusades, and the fact that that is what Jesus envisioned as the representation of his message and his mission is this is this warlike state in this guild in this palace, with the most. I mean, the Vatican is beautiful,
If you
but
like that kind of thing.
if you like that kind of thing, yeah, but you know, it's a little it's a little too beautiful. If you in terms of like it's so grand and so majestic and so much gold and silver and jewels and all of that. And that completely counters the spirit to
Mm.
me of
Oh,
everything
absolutely.
Jesus was about. I think Gandhi summed it up great when wasn't it Gandhi who said, "I love your Christ, I do not like your Christians. They are
Some
so unlike your Christ." Yeah,
something like, and he says, "Hate the sin, but love the sinner," which is often attributed to Saint Paul, but
right.
and I think
Yeah.
probably comes from Leo Tolstoy, which is
Yeah.
where Gandhi's original ideas seem, his initial inspiration seems to be Tolstoy.
Yeah, about Saint Paul, I'm glad you brought him up because I would say that to me it seems like he is where all these weird sexual teachings originate.
Mm.
Because Jesus says that one thing about adultery and lust, but other than that, he sex is not something he seems to care. He definitely I definitely don't think Jesus ever mentions homosexuality or LGBT at all.
No.
And but that's what Paul's all about. And Paul's like this guy who he shows up after the party's over.
Mm.
Jesus is already resurrected and gone up to heaven, and Peter's in charge basically. And then Paul shows up claiming he had a vision on the road, and now it's all about him. Like now you guys got to listen to me now. And he fights with Peter over control over over being the main, new disciple of Jesus. And, you know, he seems to be a guy who kind of hijacked this whole operation. I know that there's some scholarly debate on whether Jesus was a man, whether he even existed.
Mm.
I don't know. I'll leave it to the experts. I Bart Ehrman is, someone I respect and admire, and
Of
he
course.
definitely believes Jesus was a real person. And I know Richard Carrier disagrees with that, and he thinks that Jesus was not. But I tend to think that he probably was a real person, and but I think that he was probably someone who, if the basic tenets of the story of him are true of what he did, that he really was a preacher, a rabbi who went against the authorities and was crucified. Um, I would think he was probably someone who truly believed he was the son of God, because the a common, thing that was said in apologetics. Apologetics is teaching you how to effectively convert somebody.
Mm.
Why would if it was all a lie, why would Jesus have been crucified? Why would Peter have been crucified? Why would all these early Christians have allowed themselves to be killed? Well, you know, it the idea of, martyrdom
Mm.
is an immediate ticket to heaven. If you're willing to if someone comes up to you and says, "Renounce God or I'll kill you," and you're like, "Okay, kill me," and you get killed and you're straight to heaven, that's like all my problems are solved in
Mm.
an instant. And of course, you'll chop off my head right now. St. Thomas More, um, the execution when he was about to be beheaded for not being okay with Henry VIII's divorce.
As seen in
He,
the movie A Man for All
yeah.
Seasons.
Yeah, he's like, "Pluck up thy spirits, man." He's, like, encouraging the guy, "No, it's okay. I want you to chop my head off. It's great. It's great." And
Help yourself.
so but yeah, so that's why that the fact that people were willing to die for it is not proof that it's true, you know? And so I think Jesus was probably I a person who was, y deluded sounds rough, but I think it's I don't think I think he was, probably from what I could tell, a overall good guy who had a positive message. He just had a belief that he was, this divine figure, and he was willing to die for it. And then his followers perhaps, faked this whole resurrection thing to keep the myth going. I don't know. This is just me trying to make sense of all of this and put some sort of timeline or explanation to it. But it's a powerful, idea that, if you die for the right reason, you immediately get eternal paradise.
Which, of course, is what any jihadi suicide bomber is told.
Exactly. Exactly.
And what's
Take it even
more,
farther.
you get 70 houris to play with as well. So, and
Yeah.
sex is not forbidden in Muslim heaven, if anybody out
No.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as to the real existence of Jesus, there isn't a single document to support his existence. There is
Okay.
nothing contemporary beyond the Jewish wars, which says there were 18 messiahs at that time, messiahs, in Judea, which is, of course, a book written by a Jew who converted and became a member of the Roman royal household under
Right.
Titus. But so there isn't evidence, and the construction we have, I think, very much, what I said about Genesis is true for Jesus. Jesus is a character in a story who fits in. So whether there was an original upon whom this story is based, it's maybe a little bit like Robin Hood. That in fact we know that there is absolutely no evidence for Robin Hood. There is a tiny bit of evidence for King Arthur, who
I was
may
gonna
have
ask
been,
about that.
he
Yeah.
may have been a Romano-Briton, and he may have fought a battle up in the north of England in around the 6th century when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, who really aren't mentioned enough,
He
they
didn't have a round table or wasn't hanging out with Merlin.
well, I got really interested in this, and again, it's because of
Yeah.
Joseph Campbell. It's a long time, about 20 years ago, and I'd never been interested in the Arthurian legends. I don't know why. And then seeing Campbell say, "Oh, look, there's this, all of this set of ideas is being expounded here," and so I read the earliest scrap of it, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth. I then read Chrétien de Troyes, who was employed in the court of Champagne by Richard the Lionheart's sister, and he writes the stories. Then you have actually wrote a novel based on Parsifal by Wolfram, which dates to about 1210. Brilliant,
Wow.
incredible book. When I came to it and read it, it was like, oh, this is going to be pretty grim, and it was actually really like a modern novel. It was full of ideas.
I'll have to
Um,
read it.
but then you get Mallory in the 15th century. He rewrites the stories, and he has the sword in the stone. We get
Mhm.
Excalibur for the first time, and Guinevere comes along. And what's happened also in, say, Shakespeare. There's not one original story in Shakespeare. Every
Right.
one of his stories can be traced to the histories of Holinshead or to various Veronese stories, particularly. It's why Verona happens so often in Shakespeare. King Lear was written less than a year before his version of it. No copyright laws. So he took that version and turned it into something brilliant. Because,
Oh,
but in the same way, I think that storytellers who want to get people to behave in a certain way twist the stories and move them around. Um,
right.
Karen Armstrong, who was a nun who then became a remarkable historian of Christianity, she wrote a book called The First Christian, which puts forward the idea you've put forward, that you have Christ, and who may or may not have been a Christ, and then Paul comes along, and she is, well, he's the man that made the religion as we have it now, because it's his
Yeah.
letters and the Acts that, and the idea, 3 of the Gospels are written by his pupils, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We only have John outside of that. So the rest of, and John, of course, doesn't tell any stories about a virgin birth or this kind of thing.
Right.
It's also true when you put it in context. Campbell's first success was a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this inspired many things, including the Star Wars films and the Mad Max films. And in Hollywood through the 80s, you had to have the hero journey, showing that your movie had all of the steps of Joseph Campbell's ideology. Campbell, in the 40s, when he published this book, he realized that the same stories were being told all over the world. And at first, he set to prove that Carl Gustav Jung was correct in saying there was a collective unconscious, and that's where these stories came from. But the more he explored, the more he realized what the actual connections were. And he eventually came to the conclusion that the stories themselves had migrated around the world. Now, one of those is essential stories, which is found again and again and again, is resurrection after 3 days. These are the 3 dark days of the moon that happen every month. And this is a magical period. We have the story of the bringing of the staple crop to just about every people in the world, whether it's rice, manioc, corn, John Barleycorn in this country. And the story is told that an aging parent is on the verge of death and they need to eat. And the young hero meets a figure who challenges him to a battle. It comes in the Arthurian legends. It's the Green Knight.
Green Knight, yeah. Just had a movie with the Green Knight, yeah.
And you get the Fisher King from Parsifal, which has the same story in it.
And the Flood too.
Yeah, you'll find it's everywhere. And what Campbell sought to demonstrate, and I think did a pretty good job of over the decades, was that these stories had originated in Sumeria. They'd then come through Babylon to Egypt, they'd gone to India, they'd even gone to China. There's a certain Cambodian influence in China as well, probably. But these stories have managed, as the Grimm brothers and others found in the 19th century, once a story has been told to you by your grandmother, it's now traditional. The fact that you can trace that story back to the 1001 Nights, the Arab stories, it's traditional in Germany. We've always had this story. So there's the one that's told of you find a guy in the middle of the night and he's looking for his keys under a lamppost. This story is told by psychologists. You can find it in a Russian movie. You can find it all over the place. And when he's asked, well, this is where you lost your keys, he says, no, but there's no light where I lost my keys. Now, this story you can trace back. It's nearly 1,000 years old, and it comes from the Mullah Nasruddin. It's a story originally told in Arabic that has now become traditional in every part of the world that it's reached. We tend to reformulate things, and there seem to be certain fundamental ideas. And I would say Jesus calling himself Son of Man, which is what he usually says, that's how rabbis normally referred to themselves, this Son of Man, rather than saying me, which is egotistical. You say this Son of Man believes. Son of God, that's John the Baptist hears a voice saying, this is my only begotten Son. But later, of course, when news of John's death is brought to Jesus, he says of the messenger, not that I believe the words of men. Now, John the Baptist hearing a voice would be the words of men. It would be John hearing it. Jesus doesn't hear it. Nobody else hears it. And other than that, except for where he says the Father and I are one, there doesn't seem to be any statement about him believing in his divinity. And he's perhaps saying, indeed, that we all have the divine spark within us, that we are created in the image of God, because not physically, but because we have imagination. And that separates us out from the millions of other creatures on the planet, that we can imagine things. And this was noted by a Jewish theologian, again, about 1,000 years ago. The Guide for the Perplexed opens with this thing, of course, we're not talking about something physical. All of these things become really interesting, as long as there's not some authoritarian saying, and this is what it means, because I say this is what it means. That, so much of, as I said before, and as Jesus said long before me, the law is made for man, not man for the law. This is a very important concept. that, and we're seeing in the Catholic Church and in the Traditionalists, of course, and you mentioned Prince Charles. Charles, or King Charles as he now is, I was still not used to that
Yeah.
idea. I've
Yeah.
hated him for a very long time now. But he does represent a kind of, and has publicly spoken about changing the world and integrating faiths and, you know, the sort of woke agenda, as opposed to the neo-traditionalist view put forward by people like Alexander Dugin, who's an advisor to Putin.
To Putin.
And he is saying, and I read one of his interminable books, it was thankfully only about 90 pages long, to try and find out what he was actually teaching. And what he's teaching is we need to go back to Ivan the Awesome. We need to go, Ivan the Terrible, as he's called in the West. We need to go back to a society that has serfs, you know, and this is what this pan-Slavic movement has been ever since it was birthed alongside the pan-Germanic movement in about 1900. That these two racist movements have persisted, with pan-Germanism emerging as neo-Nazism, particularly in the United States, but also in Eastern Europe and Germany, and with pan-Slavism rising up again with the attempt to reunite all of the Slavs under the control of a new monarch,
Yeah.
authoritarian, if we take it down that route. And so the authority of the Catholic Church, as expressed, you know, in many ways, the Catholic Church has been a force of modernism. Most people don't know that Georges Lemaitre, who gave us Big Bang Theory, was a Catholic priest,
Yeah.
you know, and had to argue with Einstein for 3 days to convince him this was the right way. They probably also don't know that there is a papal encyclical that permits the belief in the Big Bang, dating back to the early 50s, I believe. So there has been some progress, and you do have this thing. But yeah, I have the same problem you have with the idea of the Vatican City, that when Jesus says, he who would follow me must give all that he owns to the poor. And you then get this ludicrous idea that we don't own the Vatican City, we're just keeping it for when Jesus comes back or something like that. And it's, there are all of these
Yeah.
people starving, get rid of it, you know, sell it
Yeah.
all off, you know.
Yeah. Selling the guilt, selling the property of the Vatican, or selling all the gold and jewels, and that would it wouldn't end world hunger, but it would significantly help.
Hmm.
Like it would help a lot of starving kids
Yeah, and
if
if
all
you
that money was, yeah, was
use it
used for the
to give
purpose of
access to
what.
water, yeah.
For access to water, yeah, exactly. It's just, again, it's clinging to the, you know, religion, faith. It anchors you. It gives you a sense of, my feet are firmly planted on the ground, and in this crazy world, um, the creator of it loves me. That's a very empowering, that, and feeling, the feeling of, like, the creator, that the creator of everything cares about you.
Hmm.
And, some people need that to get through the day. I don't need that to get through the day anymore. But it was, the I felt like I did at the time, and it really, really, screwed me up, the
Hmm.
mental tug of war, because, again, when you get locked and loaded in that idea, that the creator of the universe loves you, but at the same time, you've got this prescription of crazy, um these crazy beliefs and crazy things you have to do in this, and that are anti-biological and objectively harmful psychologically and physically. The idea of, well, th it's like, when a parent says, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," like, "It hurts now, but, like, trust me, this is for your own good."
Hmm.
And so the Catholic Church, which claims, to speak for God, is, telling you, despite all the struggles you're having and all the pain you're in, "Just trust us, we love you, we're doing this for your own good." And, it's an extremely, it's an extremely hard thing to realize one day, that the thing that claimed to love you didn't. I mean, I'm very grateful. I still, my parents have apologized to me, and my relationship to them is still very good.
Oh,
They accept the fact that I'm no longer Catholic. They're at peace with that, but they still, attend this church, and we understand each other there, and that I'm really grateful for that. But I recognize how unusual that is, because for the most part, these kinds of disagreements tear families apart. I mean, in Scientology, it's prescribed. They have to tear families apart, but and that's often it's the same thing in Jehovah's Witnesses with this being
same.
disfellowshipped. Um, the once the creed or the group or whatever is putting a wedge or putting a block in between you and your loved ones, that's when you need to seriously question it and probably get out. Um,
I agree.
n Sometimes, you need to break contact from a family member, it's necessary, but, very often, so much of this strife over religion is so because again, the stakes that they have for you, like, if you really believe these concepts that eternal suffering awaits you if you leave this church, of course you're going to you'd be frantic. It's like you would do everything you can to pull this person, uh, to keep this person in the church, even though, like you said earlier, the idea is that in heaven you won't care, but you very much do care on earth because this person is your family member and you love them. You don't want them to suffer that fate, and so yeah, I can understand why if the sta if, if the stakes are eternal suffering, you would think, "Well, what does it matter if I'm suffering on this in this life? This is temporary, I can put up with a lifetime of of suffering if it means an eternity of happiness." But, you know, again, what kind of loving God would require you to have a lifetime of suffering, to suffer for a lifetime in order for you to be with him.
Mm,
That's the you mentioned that earlier. That's the key aspect here that makes their version of God just incoherent and having, if that's his definition of love, then love's meaningless.
mm,
If that's not a being, an entity I can pray to,
no,
I can respect, um, because I want people to be happy, and to them, it doesn't matter if you're not happy in this life because
no.
this life
Mm,
doesn't matter, and I think this life matters a lot. I'll just say I think it matters very much, and that's the worst thing about all these groups is they can get you to hate your own life or to not at the very least devalue it. And your life is the most important thing you have. It's all you have,
mm.
you know.
Yeah, and in that dissociating you from reality, we know that if there is reality, then this is it. Putting aside the Buddhist notion of illusion for a moment.
I think therefore I am.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think. Um,
I think.
but
Go on.
yeah, this is real. This is actually happening. What may or may not happen in the future. Um, Jesus said, "Have no thought for tomorrow." So there might be
Yeah.
something in that idea, which I take to mean invest yourself thoroughly in now, and rather than doing harm and feeling hate, do good and feel love, and
Yeah.
you'll feel better for it, and the world will be better for it, and all of these just crazy sets of ideas in which we find ourselves you're caught up. There is no necessity for that. We don't have to live that way. We don't have to be told what to do. We can we can grow up, and
Yeah.
I would say, I'm 68 years old, and I'm still growing up, as my wife can tell you. Um, but the process is, which was a turbulent process as a teenager and through my 20s and 30s. It was very difficult being alive. There's so much conflict and contradiction. And now I live a very contented existence, um, which I hope gives some hope to people who've survived cultic experiences, that
Yeah.
that it is possible to arrive at your own conclusions and to say, well, I'm very interested in the way other people construct the world, but I've understood that they don't have the authority, they don't have the understanding. They're teaching me something based upon feelings that they have. And I usually
Yeah.
come back to this at some point, the feelings of knowing, the sense that we know something. And I tell the same story. When I was 17, I spent a couple of hours talking to a Bible basher, and a very polite conversation, but I just happened to have reread the Gospels, and I was not a believer. And so I was quoting this stuff back at him, which seemed to be in conflict to some of the things he was saying. And after a couple of hours, he grew tired of me. People do eventually. And he backed away from me and said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. I don't understand it, but I know it's true.
Yeah.
How can that possibly be real? And so much better to be agnostic, to say, I don't know. And I choose neither to believe nor disbelieve. It
Yeah.
really doesn't bother me. And then we see the fervor that develops in people. They get so upset that they're willing to go out and kill on behalf of the idea of love. They're willing to go out and kill for the Prince of Peace. And
Yeah.
you talked about the Vatican army. Julius II, who commissioned Michelangelo, Sistine Chapel, and the incredible tomb that was made for him. He was said to be the first pope to lead the papal army into battle, which I always thought was a wonderful idea. There's a book by the historian Barbara Tuchman called The March of Folly, where she takes 6 periods of history, ending up with Vietnam, and she was in trouble because she was a protester. She thought that the Vietnam War was a bad idea, and explains
No, it
why.
wasn't? It
Yeah,
wasn't a good idea?
apparently not.
Yeah.
But should have left it as a Chinese colony. We'd all be fine then. But
Yeah.
she basically goes to the period of the 6 popes, which of course includes Alessandro Borgia. Now, the idea that there's been any transmission of goodness via Alessandro Borgia, his son was Cesare Borgia, who's the subject of The Prince by Machiavelli and said to be one of the most horrific dictators of all time. And his daughter was Lucretia Borgia, the well-known poisoner. So you're going, hang on, he was Pope and he had kids. It's like, yeah, it's fine. He's a representative of Peter on earth. Don't worry about it. It'll all become clear when you get to heaven. And there's this story that is in the records that Barbara Tuchman tells of, I think it's in the Vatican chapel itself, where Alessandro Borgia, Pope Alexander, is entertaining his daughter, the famous poisoner, Lucretia Borgia, by having prostitutes pick up chestnuts from the floor with their pudenda. So this is the head of the Catholic Church, and he's not on his own. She gives the histories of 6 of them, one after the other, showing these horrific excesses.
Yeah.
I don't know whether anybody over there watches Father Ted, but that it was a comedy that came up in Ireland at a time when you really weren't meant to say anything about the Catholic Church. And the image that's given of the Catholic Church is that the priests in Ireland are stupid fundamentally, which several of them probably were. And so you have these conversations between these priests about various aspects of dogma. But every time that Father Ted has a problem, he rings his friend in the Vatican. And you see them on the other end of the line, all sort of lying about drinking and smoking cigars with call girls and what have you. And I sometimes think that there might be a certain, I don't think it's true of Pope Frank. I think he's a well-meaning sort of bloke, but I wasn't keen on Ratzinger.
No. I don't know if Ratzinger was up to that kind of thing, but he was not a very he was a kind of an extremist, an extremist
a
for sure.
childhood in the Hitler Youth can do that to you, I imagine.
Yeah, little bit. And also, I mean, I mean, obviously, just biologically speaking, if you have a culture built around sexual repression, um, it's gonna get a little freaky when invariably, people you need to release that. You need a way to because you can't biologically you just can't let all that stuff fester and build up and just sit in you, and that's how what happened with me. This stuff just festered and sat in me,
Mm,
and it and I have I'll hold my hand up. You can see my hands kind of there's sort of a tremor in them that's sort of
mm,
always there. I'm always kind of like, again, with my chronic anxiety and depression, I've always got this slight tremor in me, this sort of like shakiness. Yeah, and it's there could be lots of reasons for that, but a good reason, a big part of it, from what I understand, is all the repression which was basically my entire high school experience from 14 to 18 was all I was doing was doing a lot of stuff to distract myself from my normal healthy sexual
mm,
thoughts, including kneeling on my fingers and stuff, and like I mentioned earlier, but you know the again, and of course, the abuse crisis, with the priests that's been going on probably since the beginning, when you've got someone who's taken a vow of celibacy, and then they're around these vulnerable kids who
mm,
have to, again, in confession, you have to go into detail about your sexual thoughts with the priest if they ask for it. There are many instances where I'd be in confession. I'd say something like, "Yeah, I was thinking about bikinis last night," or I looked at a girl at the pool, for a little too long, and I would be pressed for details like, "Okay, how many times? How long?" And when you've got these children who are being told by the priests in these instances to give more details and to say these things in a room where it's just the two of them, I mean, it's just it's obvious, it's an obviously dangerous situation to
mm,
anyone who has eyes to see, yet it happens all the time, where children are ushered into these rooms with these men on a daily basis. And it angers me. I think that there's actually a push being done right now by Pope Francis is actually seriously considering ending the requirement
mm,
for priestly celibacy, which, if he does that, would be amazing. But the traditionalists, of course, are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that doesn't happen, and they'll ignore it if he does. The most traditional Catholics will probably just ignore any decree Francis gives. A chunk of them believe he's not the Pope. There's a subgroup in traditional Catholicism called the sede vacantists. Sede vacante, Latin for the chair is vacant,
mm,
and they think that basically we haven't had the Catholic Church has not had a legitimate pope since the Second Vatican Council.
mm.
And one prominent example of a sedevacantist Catholic is Mel Gibson.
Okay.
He does not believe that Francis is the legitimate pope.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and as again, when we bring history in the idea of celibacy among priests comes about 1,000 years after Jesus, and
exactly. Yeah,
it would appear that the main reason is so that the church doesn't have to pay for the wives and children of priests. And
right.
there's a famous instance when King John was excommunicated and the whole of England was put under interdict by the Pope in 1208, somewhere around there, the beginning of the 13th century. And he retaliated by confiscating all of the priests' housekeepers, which is to say, the women who lived in sin with the priests and had children by
Right.
them, but were not allowed to be married to them. So
Yeah,
it
housekeepers.
it has this, you know, that once something becomes a rule, it then becomes, well, are we meant to cross our suspenders or do we have them straight? Where does it say in the Bible how we're meant to? And if we have a telephone, can we have one inside the house now, or does it have to be outside the house? And with our buggies, do the horses have to be brown, or can we have white horses? Or that we get down into the minutiae of control. And then,
Yeah.
as you say, I think it's with Jerome that somewhere in the third century that sex really becomes a central issue to Christians. I don't think it was before then. As you know, Paul, as
No.
you say, had said it's better to marry than to
Yeah.
burn. But um, and it might be. I don't know. I'm married, and it's certainly better than burning. But
Yeah.
it becomes a focus, pathologically so, that you can see that this is an illness that grows up within the belief system. So
Right.
if we look at the Shakers, for example, who invented the washing machine and gave us Shaker furniture, this is a sect that died out because of celibacy. And when the American state decided they couldn't adopt all of the children from orphanages, they couldn't adopt children anymore, they died out within a generation. So celibacy
Yeah.
is not necessarily good for the human race. It's a
No.
protest I have with Buddhism and with Christianity. The idea that you take what are meant to be the best, the purest, and the brightest people and make them celibate,
Yeah.
and they're the role that they should have is as fathers, not fathers to the community.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you can be a father to community unless you've
Mhm.
had children and understand, real sacrifices and the things you
Right.
have to kneel on your fingers at any point to understand, you know, when your baby wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning and won't stop screaming, that love is not shouting at the baby. Love is this. And I think that's something that the Jewish and Muslim and Hindu beliefs have, that they accept that being a father being a parent is a very important idea. In in those Christian communities, and of course, the Orthodox community, priests are allowed to marry. Zen priests are allowed to marry, but you then have monks who are celibate.
Yeah.
And how much benefit they bring to the community, I just don't know. I think it's a very difficult question, and I agree with you. We are physical beings, and our sexuality is just a normal part of who we are. Uh, and especially if
Right.
it's something that's consenting in private and nobody is physically or psychologically harmed, it's nobody else's business. And it just seems kind of weird that you'd be going around and asking children to tell you what their sexual thoughts are. That really does seem perverse to me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, it's too to them, it's too human. And again, it's going back to this idea of humanity is just intrinsically flawed and broken.
Mm,
So having sex is pretty much the most human thing you can do. And because of that, well, obviously, because it's the most human thing you can do. It's not divine.
it's
It's
animal.
not a. It's an animal. Yeah, it's an animal-like behavior. Yeah, exactly. It's too much like the animals, and so to reach for the divine, you have to eschew anything connected to that or anything related to that. And the emphasis about obviously you have to have sex to keep the human race going, and so and when they want sex to be as basically as clinical and dispassionate as possible. They don't necessarily say, you shouldn't enjoy it, although, depending on how deep you go into the rabbit hole of books they write and teachings that they give, some of them will like like this is deep into the rabbit holes. Some of them will even say like make it as least enjoyable as possible. Try to find ways to make it unpleasant as much as possible. And of course, you can't. It's all about having as much kids as you possibly can.
Mm,
All their families, it's 10, 11, 12 kids. Um, I don't think that, and from what I could tell, for the most part, these families seem fairly happy. But I just think that it's not good. You can't raise kids. I don't think give them as much attention as a child needs if you've got to do it 12 times in a row. But by the 12th kid, the parent is going to be a little burnt out and fried, and they're not going to have nearly the same level of care to
mm,
their youngest child as they might for their oldest. That's not to say, that it's that's an across the board situation. But I don't know. It's like I, I I wish these people just weren't living in this headspace of hating themselves, because to this day I still have kind of a deeply ingrained self-hatred.
mm,
That's been the main thing that's made my life, not the best life it can be. Self-hatred is a daily struggle of mine. There's a little voice in my head that amplifies loudly every little mistake I make. And it makes me it really, really negatively affects my social interactions if I'm
mm,
constantly thinking in my head if I've upset or anyone with every word I say and every action I
mm,
do. And but scrupulosity is encouraged in that environment.
mm,
And so these people, all of them, without realizing it, are kind of just wallowing in self-hatred.
mm,
And that's just I feel very sorry for them,
mm,
for everyone who are in. And I'm also at the same time very much a believer in live and let live.
yeah,
And if your faith and your experience of religion brings you joy and happiness, then more power to you. Go right ahead. But from my own experience, I know how I ended up, and I know what happened to me and the damage it's done to me. And I saw and I've definitely talked to other people who I knew at the time or who I grew up with who feel the same way and have the
mm,
same experience. But obviously a lot of people there still don't feel that same way. And I just hope that they start to take their own mental health more seriously. And start to think that. And I don't know who said this, but I think it was attributed to Benjamin Franklin, the God helps those who help themselves. I don't remember exactly where it
mm.
originated from, but I would ask
Somebody
to
will
them.
tell us.
Yeah, somebody will tell us. I would ask them, think about that.
Mm,
God helps those who helps themselves. God put you on this earth to do things. He didn't put you on this earth to just surrender your thought brain, surrender yourself to and enslave yourself, basically. Respect yourself enough to and think through these things and think through these harmful teachings and of that pulverize your sexuality. Respect yourself a little more. And yeah, I deeply understand and emphasize with the religious impulse, the urge to worship, the urge to commune with something greater.
mm,
I have a theory. I don't know how you feel about panpsychism. It interests me. I don't know if I totally agree with it or not. The idea of like the universe being alive. The universe is kind of like a giant brain. That appeals to me because I think it can answer the question as to why we have an impulse to commune with a divine intelligence, or why we think there is one in the first place. Maybe we kind of have some experience of the larger consciousness of the entire universe, and we interpret that as a divine, godlike, intelligence or something like that. But Bernardo Kastrup thinks that the universe that's the conscious universe is like confused and unsure of itself. And I think that makes a lot more sense because humanity is confused and unsure of ourselves. So maybe the human condition is sort of a reflection of the universal condition. I don't know, but
As
I
above, so
definitely
below.
want. What's that?
As above, so below.
As above, so below, exactly. And so I think that, you know, I like you, I am fascinated by religion as well. And it's an extremely human phenomenon. But again, so is sex and everything. But in their mind, because it's human, it's bad. And that, again, to sum it all up and to not go too off on a tangent here, I just would say that, I would encourage the people who I grew up with who are still in this environment, and further than that, anyone who's in any destructive cult, abusive, authoritarian like religious group or any group at all to just start loving yourself more and look at yourself in the mirror and say, I deserve to be happy and I deserve to decide what makes me happy. And I think that it's my decision. And because all these groups tell you, like, you don't know what makes you happy. We do. You don't know yourself. We know you better than you know yourself. And that's that's totally illogical. You know you more than anyone else does.
Of course.
So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think an essential part of Christian belief, with which I absolutely agree, is the notion of forgiveness. And while Jesus said that there's only one prayer you should be saying, and that's the Lord's Prayer. So God bless mummy and daddy is not actually one of the things that Jesus said we should be saying. And in the Lord's Prayer, we have that we forgive others their trespasses, and we want to be forgiven for our own.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you've come to a situation where you're finding it impossible to forgive yourself. That so the self-hatred that you've been taught, many people, I was surprised to find this, but most people actually do have an inner voice that's either soothing them and encouraging them or attacking and criticizing them.
Yeah.
I don't have any inner voice.
Hmm.
I am,
It must be nice.
yeah, but it just seems an odd thought to me. So where did this thing come from, and what's it doing in there? And this idea, I most certainly have a conscience. I most certainly think about things, but the idea of separating myself, that seems to me the danger inherent in many religious beliefs, in many psychological beliefs. The idea that you have an inner enemy, the id, the animal self, the super
Yeah.
ego. We certainly have that, that what are the rules of society and am I keeping to them, or should I break them, because that'd be fun. But all of that is, in the middle of that is ego, the self, and without getting into egotism, and to be undivided, to go, well, I don't actually have an unconscious mind that's my enemy. I have unconscious processes because I'm not conscious of them. And I also do take the contemporary view that we're the amalgam of all of the processes going on. There isn't I don't think, a soul or a kind of central direction. Neurologists are now talking about the default mode setting. And that's what used to be the soul, apparently. Um, I don't know, but what I am fairly convinced of is I am the unity of that amalgam. I am that conglomeration, and it feels like one thing to me. So I don't permit that voice in my head. I don't have that voice in my head, and it means that looking back over 68 years, I don't feel guilty. I used to. I used to feel quite guilty because just before I left Scientology, I was running a business and I hired a guy who'd been worked with Hubbard, was a really significant character in Scientology. He'd been the commanding officer of St. Hill down in East Grinstead, and he was on a leave from Hubbard's Sea organization, and he worked for me for a while. And one day we ran a little agency for artists. I paint, and my wife would go out selling paintings. And one week she hadn't sold anything, and he took her into this tiny little room and screamed his head off at her, telling her that she was trying to destroy me and suppress me and all of this stuff. And I hesitated outside the room. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know that this was standard around Hubbard. It's called a severe reality adjustment, I found out, and it's one of the things that made me leave Scientology, realizing that Hubbard was a screaming maniac, and I had no aspiration to that. I don't want to become that. But I felt terribly guilty about that for years, that I'd not intervened at that point. I did. Next time I saw him, I asked him what he was doing, and he burst into tears and explained it to me. But I said this to my first wife, 10 years or so back, having festered in the guilt all of these years of, how did I let him do it? And she said, I don't remember that.
Oh,
So
nice.
I, my message to you here and now is that you deserve to be forgiven. You not only deserve to make, your choices about who you are and what you do, you absolutely deserve to be forgiven and to forgive yourself. That surely is what Jesus was saying. That's the
Yeah.
essential message. You're forgiven of your sins. Now go forward and do good in the world, which of course is what you're trying to do by exposing the evils of this group and
Thank
help
you.
help the people to overcome those evils.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and I do know that rationally. Like, rationally, I know
Mm,
that I
of course.
I should forgive myself. It's just untangling the emotional knots,
Mm,
because, emotionally, it's hard for me to not associate forgiveness with the sacrament of
mm,
confession, because forgiveness is very ritualized in Catholicism, right? You sit down in the room, and it's different in Novus Ordo. Now a lot of the times you're face to face with the priest in a room, but in the old ways you're it's like the two booths that's
mhm.
divided, and there's a little
Yeah.
sliding thing that you talk through, and
Which we've all seen
you
in The Sopranos.
right, yeah, in The Sopranos, and it's, in movies and TV, you see it all the time. That's
The
how it was
Godfather.
done for up until Vatican II.
Mm,
Um, you say out loud your sins
mm,
to the priest, and depending on the priest, you may be asked for more details or be scolded to some degree for doing these things.
mm,
And then after maybe you've been scolded, maybe you've divulged more than you wanted to, and that just sort of makes you more upset. The priest will then say, okay, I forgive you of your sins in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But before he does that, you have to do something called an act of contrition.
mm,
It's a little memorized speech you give, and part of it is you promise to never do these things again. Yeah, it's called a firm purpose of amendment. You
mm,
promise that you'll never do these things again, and part of the things, 13, 14, 15-year-old me are promising to do, I'm promising to do things I biologically can't do, you know? And so, to not lust, not look at, not look at pictures of women who aren't, wearing nun outfits, And so, um, that's an exaggeration, of course, but their rules about modesty are
mm.
very,
Yeah, you've got to keep
draconian
your
and
ankles
strict.
covered. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in church for sure, and it varies as to, the standards they have for the girls.
Mm,
But, I would just say that, again, the issue of forgiving myself, it's definitely work in progress because I've rejected. I know that I don't need a priest to say I forg to say these words and say I forgive you of your sins, but because that was my experience growing up, and it's what my young mind, my young Plato mind was conditioned with, to not f to feel to give myself the authority to to give the forgiveness to myself, to not have to get it from a man in a white with a
mm.
dog collar on. That is, the struggle
Mm,
still
of
is,
course.
because in their world, the where you can't have morality doesn't come from you, and what your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own um version of your view of reality is meaningless in their world. Absolutely meaningless. You just follow the text, follow the teachings, um unquestioningly.
Mm,
And that's the message that you preach. That's the message I'm starting to preach now. All these other, people speaking out about cults, it's all about sending a message of, you know, respect yourself and forgive yourself and understand the autonomy you have in your own life.
mm,
And it's terrifying to a lot of people because they don't know what to do with their autonomy. And so rather most people, a lot of people, it seems, want to their autonomy is like something, this strange thing they don't know how to handle, and they want to give to someone else. Here, you handle this. You figure this
Yeah.
out. Um, and the people who are willing to do that are usually narcissists and do not have good intentions. Do not actually care about your happiness.
Mm.
They care about using you for their own means.
Yeah, and it, there's a difference between guilt and shame. It doesn't exist in the dictionary definition, but it's often psychotherapists will separate out that guilt is a healthy feeling, that you feel you've done something wrong and you want to atone for it. You want to do something about it, unless you're a psychopath, of course. Shame is the enduring feeling that you are shameful, that there's something wrong with you. And as you say, biologically, as a man, you have a prostate gland and it has to be emptied periodically. And if you don't empty it, it'll do it for you. And
Yeah,
how the priests get around that one, I don't know. They have to wash their pajamas quite frequently, I would think. But to then, if you want to control somebody, as L. Ron Hubbard said, you introvert them. So you get them worrying about how bad and wrong and sinful they are, while you can carry on controlling whole populations and getting them to do what you want. I mean, I've
yeah.
found Eric Fromm's ideas very useful over the years, and I'd definitely recommend The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm.
Check
Um,
it out.
and it's a great, simple, straightforward book, and he puts forward one idea which I think is has really stayed with me. It's funny because I read it 35 years ago, and I kept my copy, and I reread it about 5 years ago, and I was horrified to see that many of the ideas I'd been espousing and putting forward to people I'd actually read in this book. I have to admit it.
Mhm.
There was my furious notation of the book. I always scribble in the margins in books.
Yeah,
Um, but in The Art of Loving, one of the things he said is, it's rather people sort of expect that they will fall in love and then everything will work. And I think this is true for everything in our lives, the relationship we have with the world. Um, and he says that's rather like saying, well, I'm going to be a painter. And as soon as I see the perfect subject, I'll be able to paint it without learning how to paint. And
yeah.
I do
I'll
think,
just know what to do. Yeah,
yeah. So we find out how to live. I would say that you've been given a bad rule book, an unhelpful rule book that is is designed so that you will never have control of yourself. You'll never be allowed to have that. You have to, live for other people. And I think it's good to live for other people, but I think we should live for ourselves as well. I don't take the idea, which I've heard often, that you can't love other people unless you love yourself. I'm not sure. Self-love to me borders on malignant narcissism. And by the way, Eric Fromm was the person who first gave us the concept of malignant narcissism, a book called The
oh,
Heart
wow.
of Man. And he wrote, I mean, his first book, Escape from Freedom, in 1941, was he'd escaped from the Nazis in 1933, and he was a Jewish communist who'd studied Freudian teachings. He was not going to last in Germany, so he'd gone to America. And how could this whole people come to believe this? We got to the point in 1938 where I think 98% of Germans and Austrians voted to not be able to vote anymore. They voted to have a Führer. They voted to have this
Yeah,
strange man tell them what to do. And that's a weird thing and Fromm came away from that saying, well, how did that happen? And he came to the conclusion it was because people were not developing a self. They had a pseudo self. They were always looking around to see if they were approved of by others, to see if they were wearing the right thing, had the right kind of car, they were eating the right thing in the restaurant, that they were, saying
right.
the right words and all of this, rather than developing a self. And the important part of that, and I'm going to connect back to Joseph Campbell here. Campbell wrote a 4-part series called The Masks of God. Each book is about 500 pages. It's great, good fun. The first one is the kind of what would have been the religion out of which religions came, and then there's one on Eastern, Oriental, one on Western, Occidental mythology, where he ties them together, then the final volume is called Creative Mythology. And his point of view was that you start out with a shamanic religion where people actually have experiences and they come back as medicine men or witch doctors or whatever we want to call them, and or shamans, in fact, if they're part of the Siberian group, and they've had an actual experience. They've had what sounds very much like a very profound hallucinogenic experience. So, I mean, Black Elk speaks. Black Elk was a member of the Lakota peoples before white people arrived. And he had dreams as a child and went through an illness. And it's a classic story of this shamanic thing.
Mm.
Campbell says you then get religions where the priests learn from a book. They don't have the experience anymore, the direct experience of the transcendent, but they teach this thing, and they often use exercises like fasting and staying up all night and harming themselves in various ways, staring at things, jumping up and down, drumming, dancing, what have you, that will induce physiological experiences, which they will then be led to believe are transcendent experiences. Campbell then says, all right, well, let's look at a new way of doing religion. Then that's the creative mythology, where he says, well, what we should really be doing is each of us finding our own artistic genius, our whatever it is that we're good at, and that can be sewing, cooking, drumming, dancing, painting pictures, taking
Yeah.
photographs, but whatever is creative for a person. It can be conversation. There are some people who are just really good at talking and listening to people and getting them to talk. Finding out what it is you're good at and then follow your bliss. What it is that fills your heart. You might not be able to get work doing it, but have some part of your day every day, 20 minutes or half an hour of your day every day, that is
Right.
you doing something you want to do. And I think he's right that does help to separate us out from the great mass of
Yeah.
humanity. And I think it is by being creatively individual that we can contribute the most to the people
Right.
around us, rather than telling them that they've got to live a life of misery so they can go to heaven, some nonsense like that.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing, to move beyond the kind of religion that's pushed in on you from the outside and find out what's inside of you and what you wish to believe, and
Absolutely. I mean, if
evolve.
you don't yeah, if you don't have yourself, you can't give anything to anyone else.
Yeah.
So you can't even fully be a person who's capable of, helping other people, spreading love and peace and positivity to others around you if you're in turmoil and if you hate yourself
Mm.
and if you don't think you're a person capable of making your own judgments about morality and life and how to treat if you think you're just a broken piece of crap and aren't capable of that, then you're not going to be capable of spreading you can't give what you don't have, you know?
Mm.
So if you don't have a sense of self-love, you can't get anyone else to love themselves. And
Yeah.
so all that you can spread if you have self-hatred, you can only spread self-hatred to
Mm.
others. You can only make if you hate yourself, you're only gonna be good at making other people hate themselves or spreading that kind of mental pattern or spreading that kind of way of thinking. So and it's like you said, and it's not narcissistic, it's not selfish,
Yeah.
it's not or to care about your own feelings and care about your own perception of the world and to respect your own perception of the world. And you're right, we need to get past this idea that by doing that, that's somehow self-indulgent or narcissistic even, or, no, narcissism, I would say, is and you're more you and Chris Shelton are more of the experts on that word than I am, so I would defer it more to you, but I would say a key element of it is to treat your own judgment as godlike or
Mm.
to treat your own, your own judgment, and you need to respect and love your own judgment, but you also need to be open to being proven wrong. You need to
Absolutely.
be like open to evidence, and keeping your mind open, and be in a perpetual state of discovery
Hmm,
or wanting to discover.
hmm,
And that's what the scientific method is about, right? The scientific method is not, you have to believe this. The scientific method tries as many ways as it can to disprove
hmm,
whatever theory, or, whatever's being put forward as any kind of fact. You've got to go through this rigorous trial and error process before you can even consider it as to be some sort of theorem or fact or whatever. That's not those rules don't apply in religion or faith. It's all
yeah,
about just acceptance and surrendering your own. And again, the distinction here between faith, religion, and cults is, I think, your average healthy, normal church-going person is, recognizes the distinction here between what they are doing within their lives, and the rest of the world's right to do that as well.
hmm,
But the cults say, "No, the rest of the world does not have a right to do what they want. The rest of the world needs to get with our program."
hmm,
And so, yeah, and it all boils down to, again, self-hatred and not forgiving yourself. And when you start to respect yourself and love yourself more, you're going to, I would say it's almost impossible to be in any cult if you respect yourself. Because you have to, and of course, there's also the what happens to your brain.
hmm.
The rituals, the mechanisms that get changed in your brain. It makes it physiologically much harder
Oh, absolutely.
to separate yourself from a cult-like situation.
Hmm,
But and it's again, I still have, you've had 40 years. I don't know if, you feel like Scientology has completely left you in every way, but traditional Catholicism has not completely left me by any, in terms of the way
hmm,
my brain, the way my thoughts work,
hmm,
the patterns of thinking I have, and or initial reactions or initial responses I'll have to something.
hmm,
Um, like, for example, it's very hard for me to learn guitar, because whenever there's the pressure on the strings, that my fingers feel slight pain from the pressure there, that brings me back
hmm,
mentally to when I was, doing that
hmm,
stuff. And so there's still just built-in reactions I have to that I'm still working through with therapy and all that to try and overcome.
hmm. Well,
Yeah.
and you are overcoming it. The process is, you know, I didn't I didn't leave Scientology behind. I integrated Scientology so that it
Oh, okay.
and because my experience, and it's very unusual, and it took me a while to realize this, but my experience was really fairly anodyne. I was not traumatized. I was not abused and humiliated in
Mhm.
Scientology. I paid money. They hypnotized me, and we agreed on a group delusion for a while. But I didn't find it helpful in terms of my mood or my
Mhm.
achievement outside of the idea that Hubbard put forward that I should be self-determined. And of course, I came to realize that within his definition, to be self-determined meant doing exactly what he said. And but I held on for that. So when they were trying to recruit me to get me to start a celebrity center or something like that, I went to art college instead for a couple of
Mhm.
years. It was great fun. But so I came away with a quite different experience to most people who do Scientology. And
Yeah.
obviously, you were abused and you were humiliated and you were traumatized. And it's a matter of integrating those experiences so they make you stronger, so that they make you more compassionate towards others who've had that experience. Um,
Mhm.
and that integration is a natural process. Um, Again, another book I would recommend is Ronnie Janoff Bullman, Shattered Assumptions, which is a great book about recovering from traumatic stress. And she gets rid of certain assumptions. And one of the things she says is, that what people have called denial and forcing somebody to face something, she thinks is maybe denial is a rather natural process, that we take a while to digest things, but it is a matter of digesting them. And obviously, through what you're doing, you're on the path to integrating this into your experience. And I think, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, you will be stronger, and
What?
because you want to come out here and talk about it, that of itself, it's not doing you any favors. It's not for the sake of your ego. Quite evidently, you're not becoming a guru of the anti-cult movement or anything. You're out here and there are risks in doing what you're doing, and you're doing it because you care about other people. So it has been fascinating talking with you, and
Likewise, John. It's been a real pleasure.
and we'll talk again at some point in the future.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
let you know when this goes up, and please attend to any comments if you can.
I definitely will. Yeah.
And it's been great. I'll see you again. Be in touch if you need anything.
Yeah. It's been awesome. Thank you so much, John. See you around soon. I definitely want to do this again.
Great. Real pleasure. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.